Welcome back to X-Ray in the Morning. I'm your host, Hannah.
I'm Keera.
With your other host.
I'm the other host.
It has been 2 years since Portland voters approved a sales tax on cannabis. At the time, the idea was to fund programs designed to reverse decades of systematic damage that cannabis prohibition inflicted on communities of color. But a recent city audit shows that the money collected from the cannabis tax hasn't been used as initially intended. And just a few weeks ago, the Oregon Senate moved forward with a plan to limit the state's supply of recreational legal marijuana. But how will this affect smaller growers and dispensaries? We are so excited because this morning, joining us now, we have Jeannette Ward Horton, Executive Director and co-founder of the NuLeaf Project. Jeannette, good morning.
Good morning.
We are so glad to have you on. Last Friday, we started reading some of these stories, and we're like, we need some perspective on this.
Yeah, we are very excited to pick your brain about these issues.
Great.
So the first thing when people get on your website is they see the statement, "We are unapologetically about the work of building intergenerational wealth for people of color through the legal cannabis industry." Can you tell us more about this mission statement and the work of NuLeaf?
Absolutely. So NuLeaf is really focused on rebalancing the harms of the war on drugs. In Portland, only African Americans were targeted by cannabis arrests or arrested at a higher rate than their population, about 4 times the rate of the population. So that has documented impact on people's economic futures. It has impact on their children's economic futures, arrest and incarceration, and then the long tail effects of that of inability to get housing, to get student loans, to if you've got to pay off fines and fees that usually go on for years. All of that impacts people's economic trajectories and what they can achieve and accomplish. So we see this legalization of cannabis that was used when illegal to target and really systematically negatively impact African American communities. We see the legalization as an opportunity to right those harms. To see cities and states invest that tax money that's now boon, that's now extra, back into these communities that were economically harmed. Having thriving economic communities is something that cities want, and the African American communities that were most harmed, we think that a focus should be on rebalancing that through these legal cannabis tax revenues.
Yeah,
so that's what NuLeaf does. We take some of the cannabis tax revenue where the city gives a portion of that revenue, and you mentioned the audit. So we get a really small portion, but that portion goes to funding cannabis businesses owned by people of color, as well as education and mentoring programs for those businesses.
Well, Jeannette, I want to talk to you about that more because, as I understand it, you helped write the 2016 ballot measure for this cannabis tax,
right,
which, voters eventually approved. And the original measure for the tax detailed 3 different ways that the funds were going to be divided. Can you talk a little bit about those divisions? And, well, let's start there. Can you talk about how the funds were supposed to be divided?
Yeah, so there was a portion that was going to go to kind of safety and traffic, and then a portion was supposed to go to drug rehabilitation programs, and then a portion to supporting minority and women-owned businesses.
Okay, and so the audit that's happened very recently, what did where was the money actually going? Is it divided equally between these 3 places?
Absolutely not. So not equally. So what we learned is that some money went to plug city budget gaps. So that went to places not that the voters voted on at all. And then what did go to those 3 places, about 80% went to the traffic and safety. And what we learned in the audit is we don't have accountability on really how that was spent.
So the measure didn't necessarily dictate how the revenue would be split among this, but it turns out how they spent it was overwhelmingly, what I read was like the majority actually ends up going to the police. Is that right?
Correct. That's right.
And that's just not the intent of that wasn't the intent of the measure, and that's Oh, I just get pumped up when I read it. I mean,
do you feel like that it was intentionally done? Well, I mean, obviously it was intentionally done because someone decided where that money was going.
Yep.
But do you think the voters would have voted for this measure if they had known that the money wasn't going to be divided equally?
I don't think so. And it certainly, I don't think, was the intent of voters. I think voters in Portland were really inspired by the idea that we were going to be investing this money into minority and women-owned cannabis businesses, and helping those businesses that don't have access to capital traditionally compete and create a more diverse cannabis industry. I think that's what voters were looking for, and what we got is funding of the police. And you said you've got you all passionate. It certainly gets me passionate because it is actually exacerbates the problem we're trying to resolve. When you give more funding to police, you end up over-militarizing police in a way that targets those same communities you were trying to not target or trying to help. So it's really antithetical to the point of what voters were trying to do.
And to the degree of millions of dollars. So we're talking, is it 6.5 million in just 2 years?
Yeah, and many millions went to the police, and the other programs only got a few hundred thousand.
Yeah, so some of the programs that NuLeaf works on is redistributing those funds to, like you said, women-owned and people of color-owned cannabis businesses. But you only had, $150,000 to work with?
That's right.
Can we go back to, just for any listener who isn't familiar with this issue, I think there are people who would argue, well, okay, cannabis is legal. Anybody can get into the cannabis game now if they want to, if they want to open a dispensary, start a grow, whatever. Can you talk about why would it be far more difficult for somebody who is a woman or a person of color to get into this game now?
Yeah. So the statistics show from industry to industry that this is a pattern that people of color and women get significantly less funding than white men. People of color get about 1% of venture capital funding. Wow. And we can see there was a time in the cannabis industry in Oregon when you could really start a mom and pop shop and compete, but that time is long gone. You need capital. You need funding to compete. You just heard in the news that Select ended up with a deal that's over $1 billion.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money in cannabis, and we want to see people of color and women have access to those funds so that their businesses can thrive. They don't need $1 billion. These are really smart, sharp entrepreneurs, but we want to create at least an equitable playing field where they have some capital to work with.
And so what does it mean also when the Senate is, discussing capping new licenses for folks to get into the industry right now? Yeah,
that's an important question. And what I want to be clear about with that is when you cap licenses, when you say, this is it, this is the finite number of licenses we have on the table right now, that makes those licenses more valuable, and that's great for people who currently hold them. But right now, the people who hold licenses, cannabis licenses in Oregon, are primarily white and male. So when we cap those licenses and they become more valuable, those without traditional access to capital, like women and people of color, are now even less likely to be able to afford those licenses. We just made them more expensive, and then just made it harder for people of color and women to compete. So if we really mean that we want a diverse cannabis industry, if this is the solution that the state's going to take, then they have to create a path for women and people of color that takes into account the fact that more valuable licenses is going to make it more difficult for those without access to capital to enter the industry.
Is there a precedent for that? Has there been, in any of the other states where cannabis is legal, I know, like in Colorado, I think a license is like $1 million or something.
Really?
It's insane. That's why I think everyone comes to Oregon to start their businesses. Is there a precedent, or if not, can you see a path forward for if we are going to put a cap on number of licenses that we give away in the cannabis industry? How do you make sure that women and people of color get a fair chance at obtaining those licenses?
Well, so in a way there isn't a precedent for this because So other states, when they've begun, capped licenses initially. They said, we're only going to have X number of licenses. And so California is a good example of that, and the city of Oakland was a kind of drilling into that example. Had a certain limited number of licenses, but then said, we're going to set aside licenses for people who meet certain criteria, people who lived in certain neighborhoods that were targeted by the war on drugs, or who actually have arrests themselves or close family members. So we tried to create, set aside some licenses for those who were from communities that were harmed by the war on drugs. But that was at the start. This is a new, when no one had a license yet, so this is at the start when they're handing out licenses. This is a first where you're capping licenses after we've already begun, and then trying to find an equity path for it. We don't have a model where a state has capped licenses and then said, okay, but let's be thoughtful about diversity and ensure that we don't create a more white, more male industry.
I'm just shaking my head because it's so frustrating to hear about the afterthought.
Right.
Again, in this industry, the afterthought.
In every industry.
I mean, yeah, and this is something that at least we're catching it right now, and we're seeing this budget happen. It was my understanding that Ted Wheeler was making those decisions about where the funds were going, and is there a potential to at least redirect some of these funds?
There is, yeah. And so ultimately it was the mayor's office, and what I know is happening at the city is they're taking the audit seriously. So one, it's great that the audit happened, right? The audit was actually the city's audit. So congrats to Portland for having that independent audit team that's exposing this.
Yes.
And then the city is really, especially the Office of Neighborhood and Community Involvement, which owns the Cannabis Commission, is really trying to think about how they get their arms around this money so that they've got oversight over all of it and can have better control over ensuring that the intent of the community is upheld.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and especially, forgive me because I read the article last night and don't have it in front of me at the moment. Am I correct in understanding that really a lot of that money, some of the money was supposed to be allocated for drug rehab, and really none of the money went there?
Yeah.
Which seems to me, I mean, that's like a humanitarian oversight, which just breaks my heart.
It's common. It's from state to state. You see that the intent was to spend the money differently, was to put it to places where you're really going to get some return on investment in people, like drug rehabilitation programs or investing in entrepreneurs, and then it ends up in the police. That's really common, and I hope that Portland can break away from that.
So, to hear a little bit more about the NuLeaf project, I mean, your organization was started a few years ago, and it already has done some great work to invest in people of color here in Portland. So, do you want to tell us just a little bit more about the different features that your work has been doing with the new school and the new network?
Yeah, so we are actually less than a year old. We started July 2018.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we started with the distribution of this, the first amount of money that we got from the city. And we have invested into a handful of businesses, 4 of which have gotten direct financial grants. And those grants, the return on investment has been phenomenal. We've seen 300% returns from these businesses on these small investments. These are sharp, incredible entrepreneurs, well-positioned in the cannabis industry, and they just needed a little capital. So they've hired employees, the impact, positive impact for the entrepreneurs, but also really for the city's economic health, is so strong from such a small amount of money that I'm looking forward to seeing more of these investments in these businesses as we get on the other side of this audit.
Awesome.
And so your organization is showing how these funds can actually be directed in actually small business owners, that it's going to have an impact. You have examples of this. You're like, we know how to do this work. Give us the funds. We can do it.
Yes, exactly. And there's actually federal legislation that is modeled after ours, because Portland is the first city to do that, where they are proposing investments in minority and women-owned cannabis businesses from cannabis taxes. So this is something that we always hoped we would see happen from city to city, and it's looking state to state, and this is federal legislation where it's also, they've got a proposed bill from Schumer and Jeffries. So it's really exciting to see this catch on, and give us more money and we can do more good with these businesses and with communities. I mean, businesses are hiring people. They're really contributing to the economic health of not just their own families, but of cities.
Well, it's really heartening to hear that it's happening at a federal level as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And hopefully not make the mistakes of thinking about equity last.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you, because I know part of the issue of running an organization like this is if you don't know how much money you're getting from year to year, it's really difficult to set up programs that are going to be successful far into the future, especially when you're setting people up for careers and training programs. Going forward, I mean, after this audit has happened, is there any plan for the funds from this cannabis tax to be allocated like in the same way year after year so that you have some consistency?
I hope so. I don't have a guarantee about that from the city, and you're hitting the nail on the head. It is really hard to plan an organization without that. We fundraise. We can take contributions from, we've got some cannabis businesses here locally who have begun to contribute to us, and some national cannabis businesses as well. So that's an important part of us staying solvent, of us doing multi-year planning. But it is a difficult place to be when the majority of our funding is a question mark from year to year.
And what could the average cannabis consumer do? How do they make sure that they're shopping, putting their consumer dollars where their values might be when it comes to weed?
Well, I'm happy to name some businesses. So Green Hawk and Green Box are two of the companies we have funded that are owned by African Americans and owned by women. So those businesses, highly encourage you to shop with them. You can go buy your cannabis from them today. And then, the businesses that have begun to support us, Moss Crossing is a retailer that is supporting us. We've got a list of them on our website. So if you want to know who are the businesses that care about this, we've got a list of them.
And that's NuLeaf.
Like
project.org.
NuLeafproject.org.
That's right.
Jeanette, what else can we talk about today? We've just got a few more minutes, but I am just very much enjoying picking your brain. What else do you got?
We'll hand you the mic. Say what you need.
Well, I think our next step, so I would say, is what do we want to really accomplish next, is to do this at the state level. So we're talking about the city of Portland and tax revenue from the city of Portland, but we don't have this transparency about how cannabis tax revenue is spent at the state level.
Interesting.
And we don't have the same provisions around equity at the state level. So that is an important, I think, next step, is ensuring that we get a similar equity measures for tax revenue at the state and similar transparency into how the money's being spent.
All right. So moving forward, I mean, we're in such an amazing situation where we get to be here and vote on the future of cannabis law. We're watching this industry unfold and we get to be part of it. So let's make sure that we, as voters and as consumers, include diversity as a really important part of this.
It sounds like we have some work to do to hold, even though we voted, now it's time to hold our electeds accountable for the actual intent of the law as well. So thank you so much, Jeannette, for being on this morning and telling us about the work that your organization is doing and how it's impacting communities right here in Portland and Oregon.
Really glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great morning. Jeannette Ward Horton is the executive director and co-founder of the NuLeaf Project. Thank you so much. Up next, Dylan Reef and Keera Moore and Michael Nackstead of Kickstand Comedy join us in the studio with their special guest of the week to discuss their best bets for local stand-up. Then we'll end with a new episode of Minority Retort with host Jason Lamb and his guest, Ibtihaj, I'm going to assume. Man, I gotta start putting pronunciations in here. Ibtihaj Muhammad, Olympic bronze medalist fencer.
Whoa.
Which is way cooler than the thing I just said. You're listening to X-Ray, where radio is yours. We'll be right back.